cutting up that body the way I was doing it was the hard way. The proper way is what a surgeon would do with a scalpel, and he would cut around the ligaments and then do it in the joint. You're not going to go and try to cut through the goddamn bone like I did.
Welcome to Very Scary People. I'm Donnie Wahlberg. Robert Durst is a wealthy heir to a billion-dollar fortune. He's best known for his connection to 3 bizarre and highly publicized incidents: his wife's sudden disappearance, his neighbor's violent death, and his best friend's murder. Durst has been described as a man of stunning contradictions who left a world of power and privilege to live life in the shadows. His story is complicated, mysterious, and at times, truly scary. Here's part 1 of Robert Durst, the world's worst fugitive.
It's a isolated area of Galveston. It was the remnants of maybe an old pier or dock.
A man and his son are fishing. And the son sees a bag wash up.
The son said, "Hey, Dad, look at this."
The bag had a torso in it.
We sent our dive team out. We recovered additional bags that contained the legs and the arms.
But there's no head.
If the head was in the water, we would have found it, and it was not in that water.
It takes a special kind of evil to have it within you, the ability to actually cut a body up.
I've seen a lot of bodies of people who have been murdered. This was really chilling. And there's a big fear in the community. It's like, is there somebody out here who has the entire community in danger?
In one of the bags that the body parts were in was a newspaper, and the newspaper had an address. It immediately led police to the house on Avenue K, and they could figure out pretty quickly who the dead man was.
The guy that lived there was Morris Black. They go searching through Black's apartment.
What we found particularly interesting when we processed the scene for blood, we found a blood trail leading from Morris Black's apartment to the apartment across the hall.
So the police quickly contact the landlord, and they find out that the identity of the person who rents apartment number 2 is Dorothy Siner.
Who the landlord described as a particularly unattractive female.
And oh, by the way, she's a deaf mute.
Dorothy Siner indicated she may not be around consistently.
Neighbors had seen the resident from apartment 2 loading garbage bags into his vehicle the previous day.
The police went through the garbage in the back of the house.
We found a .22 handgun. We believe there's a strong possibility that .22 handgun was the murder weapon.
The police had also found an appointment slip for an eye doctor.
In the name of Robert Durst.
The police figured out Dorothy Siner is actually Robert Durst.
The police staked out the doctor's office, and when Bob came, they pulled up behind him and arrested him. And in the car was the usual bag of pot and a gun.
Police recovered a 9mm handgun and a bow saw from Durst's car. Inside his apartment, a pair of bloodied boots and a knife.
The floor was all cut up. There had been blood everywhere.
They take him down to the station and they charge him with murder and possession of marijuana.
And he definitely has a sick mind to be able to dismember a body, cut off the head and arms and legs. He was just another suspect to us. We had no idea what his background was.
And bail is set at $300,000.
The jailer says something to him like, you got it? And he goes, well, not in my pocket.
They don't have a clue who they're dealing with here. And he asks to make a phone call, and he does.
No money was wired, and he was out the next morning.
We did not really anticipate that he could make that bond so easily, particularly in light of how he was living, where he was living, and how he carried himself.
Then people from New York began calling the police department to find out if this person was the same Robert Durst related to the Durst organization from New York City.
I'm at my desk at the New York Times, and we get a tip that Bob Durst had been arrested for murder in Galveston, Texas. And I was shocked. I thought, could this be our Bob Durst?
The same Robert Durst whose wife has been missing for 20 years.
Now we're finding out that he was masquerading as a woman, and he knows how to chop up a body.
And that was the first time that the people in Galveston started realizing, oh, there's even more to this story.
When he made bond, he's given a date for his arraignment where he has to appear back in court.
Today, Durst was due in court, but didn't show.
We understood who Robert Durst was by then. Of course, immediately our concerns became his ability to escape and flee anywhere in the world because of financial means. Immediately, warrants were issued for his arrest. We realized that we had a fugitive from justice.
After his arrest for the murder of Morris Black, Robert Durst goes on the lam. He's a fugitive from justice. He jumps bail.
Robert, if you see this or hear this, please come home. You're in a very dangerous situation as a fugitive in a massive manhunt in this country.
This news is of particular interest to the friends and family of Kathie Durst, Robert Durst's former wife, a woman no one has seen for more than 2 decades.
I had the money, I was 9 years old, I had the education. I was calling the shots, as Kathie would say.
You have a quote where you say, I was very, 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 very controlling.
All that was true.
Once I heard she disappeared, everything Kathie ever said came back to me. I think I knew pretty fast that something bad had happened.
Bob and Kathie, when they met, they were completely smitten with each other right from the beginning.
She was 19 and she was a dental assistant, and she rented an apartment in a Durst-owned building.
And her roommate bumped into an old friend of Bob's. And he said, oh, I'm going to a party. Would you like to come? Everyone thought it was love at first sight.
Kathie was strikingly pretty. Bob was always a little distant.
They came from very different worlds. Bob came from a world of privilege, and Kathie came from a small town out in Long Island, blue-collar family. It was a fast-moving romance. It was really only the second or third date when Bob asked her to move to Vermont with him and open this health food store, All Good Things.
Kathie settled into helping run the store. They were just having a good time. People have asked me, what did I think of Bob when I first met him? I've always thought he was shy. And many times he would literally walk away from a dialogue that was going on and just be gone.
He used to burp or light up a joint in social situations and seemingly amused by people's reactions.
Kathie's knowledge of who and what Bob was very limited. She just met a guy that she was attracted to, and he asked her to come help run this health food store.
The Durst family was actually one of the New York City's royal real estate families. They owned about a dozen skyscrapers in Manhattan. And Bob, it was assumed for many years, was the heir apparent to this vast real estate empire.
Kathie was aware of his lack of interest in the New York scene, the business scene. I don't think he felt that he was cut out to be a real estate icon.
But after a couple of years in Vermont, Robert and Kathie returned to New York.
He was called back to the family business, and he went kind of reluctantly. Kathie and Bob got married April 12, 1973.
They keep an apartment in the city, but they also have a country home about an hour and a half north.
A breaking point in the relationship came later in the 70s when she got pregnant, and Bob didn't want to have children, and he forced her to have an abortion.
And that devastated her.
I think at that point, Kathie embarked on a more independent path. When she finished nursing school, she immediately was applying to medical school.
Which infuriated him now. He initially wants her to have a career, and now she's working towards having a career, and that makes him really angry now.
So very soon, Robert and Kathie's marriage really began to spiral downwards.
We know that she went once to Jacoby Hospital for treatment for some bruises. She didn't tell them specifically that that was her husband.
Their relationship becomes so toxic that he just completely cuts her off, to where she's begging for money from her friends.
As the marriage was disintegrating, Kathie went out and found a divorce lawyer. She didn't want to just abandon the marriage and get out with nothing.
She wasn't that interested in money, but I think she wanted enough to be able to finish medical school, maybe open a practice.
I think that Bob was afraid of what a divorce settlement would mean in terms of how much money that he would have to hand over.
Kathie went through Bob's papers. She thought she had things on him, that she could use it in a divorce.
Kathie put together a little dossier. We don't know exactly what was in this file, but it had something to do possibly with Bob's tax records or about the Durst organization.
And then it got really nasty because then she started to threaten him and the Durst family. She had information. She said she sent it to a certain senator in New York.
She was terrified of what the repercussions would be.
Kathie's friends told the police that in the months before her disappearance, she had been afraid for her life. And in fact, her next-door neighbors at the apartment in New York City described a very disturbing incident.
One night, she crawled over the divider between their two terraces in her pajamas and was banging on the window for them to let her in, saying he's got a gun.
Catherine stated that Bob had beat her and that he wants to kill her. She further stated that he had a gun and she was afraid of being shot.
By that time, her marriage was sort of a shambles. She said to more than one person,
If anything ever happens to me, look to Bob.
Galveston police are convinced 58-year-old Robert Durst killed and dismembered his 71-year-old neighbor, Morris Black.
Right now, we have 2 outstanding warrants on Mr. Durst.
Now he's a fugitive from the law, and the question is, where is he?
He had the means to evade detection, much less prosecution. He's very good at hiding the truth from as early as I got to know him. The first time I was aware that there was an issue was February 4th. Bob's on the phone and he goes, Jim, this is Bob. Have you seen Kathie? And I go, no, what do you mean? He goes, I can't find her.
Kathie Durst is months away from graduating from medical school, and she just disappears.
It wasn't until later that week that Bobby goes into a New York City police station with his dog and reports Kathie missing.
Bob walked into the 20th precinct and threw his weight around by throwing down a magazine with his father's picture on the cover.
It's the men who own New York. Donald Trump, Helmsley, there's 5 men, all power brokers in real estate in New York, and Seymour Durst.
That was a way to say, this is who I am. It was to give him some kind of authority.
He says, I haven't seen my wife. She's been missing for 5 days, and I'm wondering if maybe something happened to her.
He didn't seem particularly alarmed or upset. He said instead that she had probably gone off to score drugs.
Bobby's story was that they had a fight. He drove her to the train station, put her on a train around 9 o'clock, and that was the last he had seen of her.
At one point, he said he talked to her after she was back at the apartment.
The police believe that she reached New York City and that she disappeared from there.
Police have been searching the building, 37 Riverside Drive, where the Dursts occupied a penthouse. They say so far they have found no evidence of foul play.
When the police went to their apartment building to try and determine what happened to Kathie, there was a doorman who told them that Kathie returned to the building and that he took her up in the elevator.
And then there was a doorman who claimed that he saw Kathie leave the building the following morning.
One other thing was that someone identifying themselves as Kathie called the dean of students the next day at her medical school and said, I'm Kathie Durst, I don't feel well today and I'm not coming in.
Good evening. She talked on the telephone with her husband and with a supervisor at a medical center. Then she vanished.
No one wanted to listen to us that anything that happened to Kathie happened at their house in South Salem. We think she never got to New York, never went to the train.
Bob did some things that aroused the suspicion of Kathie's friends and Kathie's family. And they became sort of amateur sleuths looking for clues about what happened.
At some point, we made a midnight run. And we took his garbage. And we went through it, piece by piece. He was throwing away her clothes, her books, her papers, her makeup.
There was never a thorough search of the house in South Salem.
It became clear to the authorities that Robert Durst was certainly not being very expansive about what could have happened to his own wife. But he maintained that he had nothing to do with her disappearance.
However, a lot of the things that he said were quickly disproven.
He told the police that he dropped her at the station and came back to my house for drinks. He did not come to my house for a drink.
He told police that, well, maybe he didn't have the drink, maybe he took the dog for a walk, found a phone booth in the driving rain and called Kathie. He later admitted that none of those things were true.
One person who did seem to know an awful lot was this old friend, Susan Berman, who Robert met at UCLA.
Bobby was the friend of whom she was the most proud because of his family connections, who his family was.
She was the closest person to Bobby back in 1982. She knew everything that was going on.
When Kathie disappeared, Susan was his shield in dealing with the press. We know this because Susan called a friend who recorded the phone call.
The story is a crazy story, but basically I want to know if I've covered all the, I've been in charge of all the media.
This was only 8 or 9 days after Kathie disappeared.
Monday morning she called into Einstein, said she didn't feel good, she was staying home.
And she seems to be testing out different theories about what happened to Kathie.
It's definitely not a kidnap. It's not a runaway wife. It's not drugs. There's nothing else.
It's sort of harrowing to listen to the recording today.
Personally, between you and me, Albert, and never to be quoted, okay?
Yeah.
I think she's dead.
Today, the authorities believe that the call to Kathie's medical school was made not by Kathie, but by Susan Berman.
When I read that someone thought to be Kathie called the dean of the medical school and described every malady in her body, I thought, who does that? Susan does that.
She had a relationship with members of the press of kind of normalizing Robert Durst.
She claims that Bobby is worried, grief-stricken, that Kathie hung around with some bad people involved in drugs, and that they needed to be looking there.
In the news today, a reward of $100,000 offered by a husband to help find his missing wife.
This was headlines in the tabloid newspapers, and there was a lot of attention, but slowly it peters out when there were no leads.
The investigation, for the most part, is actually shut down.
There's very little evidence. There's no body, there's no crime scene even. He's not charged.
It disappeared from the headlines. It was quiet. The police may have ignored it, but I didn't forget.
Welcome back to Very Scary People. Family and friends were shocked and worried when Kathie Durst vanished without a trace. A cloud of suspicion hung over Robert Durst. No one ever heard from Kathie after she disappeared. But police said there was not enough evidence to prove a crime had been committed. Eventually, the story faded from the headlines.
Bob, he was working at the family business at the time that Kathie vanished. His brother Douglas had also gone into the family business.
And it's fair to say you pretty much hate Douglas, right?
That would be fair. Douglas wanted to take my birthright.
And he got it.
Wanted to run the company. He wanted to take my money, and he did those things.
There was friction between him and Douglas from probably the moment they were born. I don't think they ever trusted each other. Douglas tells the story that Bob would sometimes come into his office and pee in the wastebasket. And his behavior was increasingly erratic. A defining moment for Bob and for the Durst family came in 1950.
Their mother died a very tragic death.
It was a cold night, and it was a steep roof, and someone saw her out there, and they called the fire department, and a guy was going up the ladder to try to get her down.
And his mother either fell or jumped. Bob always told his friends that he saw his mother fall, but other family members would contradict him on that.
His brother Douglas stated that all 4 of the Durst children were just whisked out of the house that night, and that none of them actually saw their mother fall.
Robert was the oldest. He was about 6, 7 years old, and the death of his mother was something that he carried with him for the rest of his life, sometimes blaming his father for his mother's problems. And it led to a lot of the fighting between him and his brother. At a certain point, his grandfather encouraged them to go see a psychiatrist.
It was Dr. Schoenfeld's opinion that Robert's hostility toward his father and his younger brother was of such intensity that it might constitute a deconstructive psychodynamic force sufficient to produce a personality decomposition.
It describes his mental state. And this is at 10 years old.
Going into the 1980s, most people assumed that Bob at some point would take over the family business. But in 1994, his father and his uncle selected Douglas to become the next head of the Durst organization. Bob, according to his friends, was just devastated.
This was a crowning humiliation for Robert Durst, and he began to pull away from the family.
Robert has resented them ever since.
After he left the Durst organization, he led a very wandering kind of existence. Up to that point, he was getting about $1 million a year after taxes from the Durst Trust. And Kathie's case was nothing but a memory.
He had lived in San Francisco, in a house, in a small town way up north in California. He had also taken out, under different names, P.O. boxes. He was traveling the country, living amongst the homeless, stealing people's identification.
He alternated between living a lifestyle of extreme poverty and a lifestyle of extreme wealth from day to day.
You talk about getting food stamps. And do you know why you said you did it?
I did it.
No, but why? Well, you had more money, you didn't need it.
The only thing I can think of now is why not?
You were right, you said you enjoyed beating the government.
Yes, that.
Then about Halloween of 2000, Bob learns of this new investigation into Kathie's disappearance by Westchester County District Attorney Jeanine Pirro.
I have a lot of questions. It appears that things are not what they seem to be in 1982.
A New York State police investigator found that those eyewitness reports that had seen Kathie Durst at her apartment in New York were very suspect.
The whole essence of this case was that Kathleen had boarded a train from Westchester and arrived in New York City. Now we have to question whether or not she even made it to New York City.
Bob knew, he was kind of surmising what was happening here.
There's a new investigation, and he's going to come under scrutiny once again. So I don't think there's any question that Bob was in a panic.
It's 18 years later now, and what he does is he runs. He goes down to Galveston.
Galveston is, on the surface, a beach town. It's also a place where people go to fall between the cracks.
If you've never been to Galveston, it's kind of a funky place.
He moved into Avenue K, and it was nobody's idea of a millionaire's dwelling.
It's like $300 a month. He's going to pay it in advance. He claims to be a woman named Dorothy Signer.
A name, by the way, which happened to be the name of a former high school classmate of Durst, whom he had not spoken to in decades. The spectacle of Dorothy Signer was that of, obviously, a man who was not doing the world's best job of impersonating a woman.
He wasn't fooling anybody.
He's got to be the worst cross-dressers in cross-dressing history. They look at him and they know, this is awful.
Bob always said that he was a pretty poor woman. He'd light a cigarette and his hair would go on fire. So he dressed as a man most of the time. He was like a cousin to the mute woman who sometimes stayed in the apartment.
So he's basically on the run and kind of waiting out things to see what happens. He doesn't know if he's going to be charged. He doesn't know what they've got.
Most people, if they found out that their wife's case was being reinvestigated, they would be, wow, I'm so glad somebody's really looking at it. What made you run?
The piece I did for People came out in early December of 2000. It was the first national piece. I had spent maybe 3 weeks working on this particular story. And everyone said to me, Matt, you got to find Susan Berman. She's the key.
When Bobby called me and said she's missing, my heart felt, I'm a little bit psychic, you know, I can sort of foretell things, not to be mystical or anything. And I said to myself, she's been killed, she's murdered. I didn't tell him that.
Bobby, in the 1960s, went to UCLA, and he meets Susan. And they just hit it off immediately.
Normal life was not of much interest to Susan. Everything had to be larger than life. Enter Robert Durst, so wealthy, his family owned Times Square.
And he finds a kindred spirit in Susan Berman. She's one of the few people that he actually confides in.
Susan was, in her way, magnetic. There was this tremendous energy. She spoke a mile a minute. Upon introduction to her, she listed every neurosis she had.
Her father, who was Davy Berman in Las Vegas.
Davy the Jew Berman. He was friends of Bugsy Siegel. She relished it. I'm a gangster's daughter. It was a wonderful pedigree where Susan was concerned.
They had something in common. Bob had lost his mother at a young age. Susan had lost both her parents at a relatively young age. So that really bound them tightly together.
That friendship continues on through the 60s. She moves to New York in the 1970s. She was working on magazine pieces. They go to all the big clubs, and so they became very, very close.
Susan's career was, at that point, soaring. Her memoir was published, discovering that her father was a gangster.
When did it dawn on you that your father was just not a nice guy running a business?
Well, I was only 12 when he died, Lee, and I grew up really believing I was sort of from the aristocratic Las Vegas family.
Susan was, like Bob, a storyteller. And she liked to embellish stories, to make the stories more interesting, more compelling.
Within a year after Kathie went missing, Susan Berman moved to Los Angeles to establish herself as a screenwriter.
But as her life continues on, she's not a very successful writer. And she declares bankruptcy in the 1990s.
Susan was desperate. She had no money.
By the time that a new investigation in 2000 was looking into the disappearance of Kathie, Susan was reaching out to Bob.
Letting him know that she was having a hard time and could he help her out.
At some point, Susan told Bob, as Bob is related, that the authorities had reached out to her. And that she said, well, I think it's best that I talk to them.
What's key to that is that the police did not reach out to Susan. They had yet to call her. So that was a lie.
But Susan may have had her own reasons for lying.
Susan, by all accounts, was very loyal to Bob, but she may have been trying to gin Bob up so that he would definitely send her the money.
Susan needed the money to live, and getting that money anyway, that was necessary.
By November of 2000, Bob had sent her 2 checks, each for $25,000. And she was telling friends that she was very excited because Bobby was coming to visit during the Christmas holidays.
She was somebody that was important to you and that you cared about. Is that right?
Best friend.
Susan Berman's dogs, they had gotten out of the house and were running around the neighborhood.
Her neighbors knew that she would never allow that, and they called the police. The back door was open, the front was unlocked. They find a body on the floor, shot in the back of the head.
I remember. There was a slug, not even a headline, screenwriter dead. Susan Berman. I froze.
There were no signs of forced entry. The police assumed that Susan knew the person that she let into the house.
Among Susan's 1001 phobias was letting a stranger into her house. She would only allow in people she knew, period.
She was walking towards the bedroom when whoever she let into the house came right up behind her, put the gun next to her head, and blew her away.
The thought of Susan in a pool of blood, how she loved her dogs, but just Susan, poor Susan.
In the very beginning, the police were looking at different suspects.
There was speculation that this could have been a mob hit.
There had been all this talk about Susan Berman how she was working on some mob book, and friends would say, oh, she said she was going to blow the lid off of something.
And I just thought, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever read.
The same day that Susan was killed, someone had addressed an envelope to Beverly Hills Police, and they spelled Beverly incorrectly.
It says there's a cadaver, and he writes the address, and the address was Susan Berman's home. So whoever wrote it didn't want her body to rot there, want someone to find it. But no one really knows what's going on here. A lot of people suspect Bobby Durst, and other people don't.
Janine Pirro, the Westchester County DA, was very suspicious about the timing of Susan Berman's murder.
I think Susan Berman's death was very significant in terms of this investigation. She was someone that we had wanted to speak with.
I went out to Los Angeles to find out what had happened. I did interview some of Susan's friends and family, and all of them told me the same thing. Bobby had nothing to do with this. Bobby loved Susie. Susie loved Bob.
Two months after Robert Durst finds out that New York prosecutors are looking into the disappearance of his wife, Kathie, Susan Berman turns up dead.
The fact that Susan was going to be interrogated by the district attorney would pose a threat to someone who felt she had knowledge that he or she did not wish to get out there, because Susan just might spill. She was a loose cannon.
Susan was a very loyal person, would you agree?
Absolutely.
The people closest to Susan, maybe a little bit because of her dad, the whole mafia thing, they think that she would have done anything for you.
Damn close.
For what it's worth, Bob, because I know you cared about her, I don't think Susan ever would have said anything.
I don't think so either. She never brought up anything like that. And yes, she was always telling me about her money problems, but she never, quote unquote, squeezed you for it.
So Bobby is kind of laying low in Galveston.
He maintained that he had nothing to do with the disappearance and presumed death of his wife, Kathie, or with the murder of his best friend, Susan Berman. But he certainly knew that people suspected him of those things.
And didn't want anyone to know that he was in Galveston.
It was 10 months after Susan Berman's murder that Robert Durst was charged with the murder of Morris Black and subsequently jumped bail.
The news is out that he's now on the run.
We'd actually reached out to America's Most Wanted. We wanted the Durst case profiled on that show.
He walks into a supermarket, and it's on video. He just shoplifts.
He was caught by Wegmans store personnel stealing a sandwich. They also caught him on camera taking Band-Aids out of a box and putting them on himself.
The total theft was $9.18.
Standard procedure. He was patted down. He had almost $500 in cash in his pocket.
The police felt he was agitated. When they asked him why he stole this stuff, he just said, well, I'm just an asshole.
The officer didn't immediately know who he had.
He actually gave his real name, Robert Durst, but he gave a Social Security number, which was not an accurate number, and then later clarified it and gave a second Social Security number.
And then the police officer turns around and says, have you ever been in Texas? And Bobby just stopped talking. He knew he got caught.
Computer check revealed that Durst was wanted for murder in Galveston, Texas, and is a suspect in Los Angeles and Westchester County, New York.
Where's your wife? Do you know where your wife is?
When a search warrant was executed on his car, we found $37,000 in cash, a small amount of marijuana, and 2 more handguns.
He had rented a vehicle pretending to be Morris Black.
His head was shaved, his eyebrows were shaved. He was a clearly interesting looking character.
What about Susan Berman? Did you have anything to do with her murder? Do you have anything to say at all?
I was shocked to learn that he'd been arrested.
Mr. Durst, are you going to fight extradition?
The most wealthy man probably to ever be in the United States criminal justice system was arrested for stealing a sandwich and Band-Aids.
Can you tell me why, with all your money, what made you do that?
I look back at that thing, maybe I wanted to get caught. I certainly can't explain it any other way. Being a fugitive was not something I did well. I was the worst fugitive the world has ever met.
It really just belies or reveals the true psychology of Robert Durst, that he is above the law. He doesn't have to pay for anything, whether it's a murder charge or whether it's a chicken sandwich.
Robert Durst says Morris Black was accidentally killed in self-defense.
If Morris Black was here right now, he'd be saying, I'm thinking 2 words, and one of them's bull.
They're saying that Durst shot Morris Black dead center in the back of his head. But you can't say that because you don't have a head.
A new, stunning revelation.
I stood up and gasped.
I do want to say I am not guilty.
There is no forensic evidence whatsoever linking Bob to Mrs. Durst's disappearance or Miss Berman's murder.
Anything he does is pretty much calculated.
That's how cold this man is.
Robert Durst was sent back to Galveston to stand trial for the murder of Morris Black. He agreed to testify before the jury. The details of what happened to Mr. Black were violent and disturbing. The verdict and another shocking twist in part 2 of Robert Durst. I'm Donnie Wahlberg. Thanks for watching. Good night.